Is Daf Yud Gimel, 13, page 13 in Masechet Nazir, and we are up to the Mishnah, 4 lines from the bottom of Yud Bet Amud Bet. It's actually a really interesting Gemara. I guess they all are, but it's pretty confined, and I think everyone will find it very interesting. So says the Mishnah, Hareini Nazir, a person commits to being a Nazir, Likishiyah li ben, when I have a son. This person, and I guess, and I really think, I mentioned this before, that, this was clearly part of the bargaining that people used to do, with God. Like, I'll be a Nazir if this happens, I'll be, and the Torah sort of uses it that way, but that's the way to show gratitude and commitment and all the things that people do. You wish to dedicate something if you get something good. So a person really desperate to have a child, they say, if I have a son, I will be a Nazir. And nolad lo ben, and then their partner, their wife, gives birth to a child. Haray's a Nazir. Okay, person's a Nazir. Seems pretty obvious. The Gemara is going to ask, why are you even telling us this? Continues the Mishnah. Nolad. I would have said I'll be a Nazir if I'm going to have a daughter. If you're nolad lo bat tumtum vandrogenes, if your person's wife gives birth to a daughter or a child who is not clearly a son. Okay, now this is obviously gets us into very complicated discussions about what a tumtum and androgynous is. Literally the words tumtum means that it's confused, that you don't know. And usually we say that means that the genitalia are covered, right? They're like internalized. So you don't know if there are testicles inside, you don't actually know what it is. And androgynous is someone who has both male and female genitalia. So there's some ambiguity. Then Eino Nazir. So because you said that I'm going to have a son, this is not a son. If you say imamar likishe livlad, there's a machlok about the girsa here. I read what's not in our Mishnah. When I see a child, but the Mishnah says kishe livlad, when I have a child, and we'll see why that matters. Then afilo no labat, even a girl counts as a child, believe it or not, and tumtum vandrogenes. So any child.
We're so lucky.
Any child counts. But if you say, now, here it gets complicated. Harez and Nazir is the last words on the page, and then turn the top of Daf Yud Gimel. And then Hipila Ishto. Then his wife gives birth to a non-living child. We're going to call it that. Now, this is very complex. It's complex because there's a lot of different implications, of course, right? But one is that it's conceivable that she gave birth to a child that's viable, and something happened. The child died asphyxiated in childbirth, swallowed some meconium, or was strangled by the cord, or was mistreated by the midwife, whatever the things could be. In which case, she gave birth to a child, and unfortunately, there was a terrible accident, and the child's not alive. Or it could be that it was a stillbirth, what we would call a stillbirth, that it was a non-viable child. Now, of course, part of the reason it's so complicated is that Chazal were very insistent that which is true to some extent, that the time of a child's viability depended very much on the gestation, right? So that a lot of it had to do with not what the baby looked like, necessarily the fetus looked like, but with how many months it had been gestating, which of course they had no way of knowing prior to ultrasound, right? There was no real way to determine. So the question is, was this child feasible for it to be alive? Was it a ben sheva, which is what the Gemara calls it, a 7-month-old gestation, which is alive, an 8-month, which is not, a 9-month, which is. So there's some doubt whether this person actually had a child or not, because his wife was pregnant, she gave birth, the baby was not alive, was dead, but was it alive and then died, or was it viable and then died, or was it not? So says the Mishnah, Eino Nazir, you're not a Nazir. Now the Gemara's going to explain it's not because you don't have a child, because if you had a child and the child died, you would still be a Nazir, right? You didn't say, I want to have a child who lives necessarily. You should have, but you didn't. But because it's a suffix, we don't know if you had a child or didn't have a child. And therefore, suffix Nazirut is lahakel. You don't, if you have a suffix, you don't go. The Gemara is going to say, remember we had a case earlier in the Masechet where a person said, I'm going to be a Nazir if there's 100 apples on that tree, right? And someone else said, and then they went and the tree had fallen down and they couldn't count them. It wasn't the case, but it was a kri. It was a pile of grain. So before we had the opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, you're not a Nazir because you're never a Nazir from suffix. Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says you are a Nazir from suffix. So Rabbi Shimon says that you would be a Nazir. The problem is there's a big problem with being a Nazir Misafek. What's the problem? That at the end of your Nazirut, you have to bring karbanot. And you can't bring karbanot if they're a maybe, right? You can't go to Beit HaMikdash and bring a karban and say, here's my karban, I might be a Nazir, right? So you're sort of stuck. You can never bring your karban. So you can observe Nazirut, that's easy. You just don't drink wine and don't be mitameh. But how can you ever bring the karban? So says Rabbi Shimon, this is what you should do. Yomar, you should say, we got it? This man should say, Im haya ben kayama. Look, if this kid was alive and then died, so this stillbirth was a live kid, then harayani nazir chova. Then I have to be a nazir. I'll wait. I'll do 30 days of nazirut, and I'll bring a karban, and it'll be perfectly good. And I make a condition im lav if it turns out that, and we would never know, but if it turned out that this child was not alive ever, harayani nazir nidava. I then accept to be a nazir again as a nidava. So then you sit your 30 days of Nazirut, you go bring your karban, and either way, either it's a chova because of your neder, or, it's a ndava because of what you just said. So you bring one karban. Let's say, now that seems very good, but let's say 2 years later, your wife, or whatever amount of time later, chazra v'yalda, she goes and gives birth to a child that lives, let's say. So now, according to the Tanna Kama, well, you made a neder 2 years ago that if your wife gives birth to a child, you're going to be a Nazir. You didn't say it had to happen right away, right? The first birth was a stillbirth. It doesn't count. The second one is you're a Nazir. So now you're a Nazir. But according to Rabbi Shimon, it's a problem because according to Rabbi Shimon, there's a suffix. The first time, you're not sure if you were a Nazir or not. So you acted as a Nazir, right? Because you made this condition. That if that baby was alive, I was a Nazir because of that. If the baby's not alive, I accept to be a Nazir on my own. But now you have a new baby. So if that first baby was not alive, then you have to be a Nazir for the new one. If the first baby was alive, you don't have to be a Nazir for the second one, right? So according to Rabbi Shimon, you're a little stuck. So says Rabbi Shimon, what you should do is you have to, Rabbi Shimon Omer, you got to make another condition and be a Nazir a second time. You've got to say, Im harishon ben kayama. If that first child 2 years ago was a viable child, then the Nazirut I did 2 years ago was Rishon Chova, and now I'm going to do a Nidava. Im lav Rishon Nidava v'zu Chova. So you observe a Nazirut the second time, and you make this condition. That is Rabbi Shimon. Says the Gemara, before we get to the details of Rabbi Shimon and that issue, what about the first part of the Mishnah? What's the Chiddush? If a person says, I'll be a Nazir if I have a son, you have a son, you're a Nazir. I mean, that seems pretty obvious. Hi, Maila Memra. Why do you have to tell us that? Mishum Seifa. Well, we're telling it to you because of the next words. It says afterwards that if you give birth, if your wife gives birth, where you have a bat or a tumtum or androgynous, Eino Nazir. Well, that's also Pshita. You said if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir if I have a ben. Well, Ma'adatema, that we would have thought that, ben does not mean a son necessarily. Ben means, and now we use the word that what's her name said that Rachel said, right, when she was having trouble conceiving, she gave her shifcha Bilha to Yaakov and said, Ulai ibaneh mimena, I will be ibaneh, I will be built, is how he said, from binyan. So a ben might just mean my future, a child. Doesn't necessarily mean a son. Ben could be a term for child. You would have thought. Ma'adatema, what she's saying is the husband is saying, whenever I have a child that carries on my legacy, that's not what people generally mean when they say a son. They generally mean a boy. Okay, so therefore you're not a Nazir. Now, then we continue. We said, if you say when I have a child, then even if you have a girl or a tumtum or androgynous, you have to be a Nazir. This is my pshita. They're also children. No, Ma'adatema, you would have thought that what people mean is Vlad de Michshav Beini Inshi Beina. I want a kid. I don't really know how to translate this in a non-offensive way, but I want to have a kid who is counted among men. Beinan, meaning I want a child that is a I still don't know how to say it. I guess in a society where that's all counted, right? It can be part of the minyan. But I want a kid who can be michshav. That's not what it means, but a kid who can be who is part of the male-dominated society. Kamash Malon, that's not what people meant. So we have a little bit for egalitarianism, a little bit. So, not cold comfort. That's the Mishnah. Continues the Gemara. What about this complicated case, right? A person says, "I'll be a Nazir if my wife is a child," and the wife gives birth to a stillbirth child. And again, The exact, I use stillbirth. It's not clear that's what it means. Hipila can mean any kind of non-viable, not alive. But again, you don't know when that baby necessarily died and was it viable and then died, right? So says the Gemara, Man Ketanila, who's the Tanakama who says that you don't have to bring a netter, you don't bring Nazir at all because it's a safek? That's Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda, decree who? Rabbi Yehuda, the case of the decree, which was the pile of grain where you said I'd be a Nazir if there's 100,000 pieces there, and then the pile blew away, so we never know. Rabbi Yehuda said you're not a Nazir because it's a safek. We just have no way of knowing. And Rabbi Shimon then says, Im haya ben, it is you have to be a Nazir. You got to make it tonight. You got to make a condition. If that child was viable, then I'm a Nazir because of that. And if not, I accept to be a Nazir on my own, and therefore you sit for a Nazir for 30 days, and you bring your karbanot for one of the conditions. Says the Gemara, Rav Abba mirafuna. Rav Abba asked Rav Huna the following interesting question. If a person says halfway down, you'd give him an aleph, Hareini Nazir l'kishiyah liben. Now, the way Tosfos understands this case, I don't know, Rashi, this is not Rashi, this is the Mefarish on the right. The way the Mefarish understands is not so clear to me. But the way Tosfos speaks it out and other Rishonim is that we're talking about a case where a woman was pregnant with twins, right? And a person said, I will be a Nazir if my wife gives birth to a child, let's say. Because unfortunately, many people didn't give birth to children, right? They died in childbirth, or they died before childbirth. So then what happened was that she had a miscarriage, and one of the babies was delivered stillborn or not alive, right? So Hipila Ishto, and he then, maybe he didn't know exactly, we'll see what the case is, he frish karban. Then the husband set aside a karban because he said, oh, I'm going to be a Nazir because my wife had a child, and I'm setting aside this animal as my karban. And then, let's say, eventually, then chazra v'yolda. Then the next day, she gives birth to a viable child. This is the way Tosfos understands. I mean, it doesn't have to be the next day. It could be 10 minutes later, but it could be 5 days later. You know, then she gives birth to a live child. Tosfos understands what the reason we're asking the question, and again, it's a little bit of a stretch, is that because since the second child was born viable, we assume that the first child was also viable, right? Because remember, I said a lot of viability in their minds had to do with how much time it gestated. So the assumption was if one baby came out and was viable, the other one was also viable, just died in childbirth, or some terrible accident happened, or got a blood clot, or whatever might have happened, right? But that it was a viable child. So therefore, the question really is, you know, the first one is more likely to have been viable than the stomp case in our mission. So the question is, Mahu, what happens to that animal that you were mafresh? Now, says in 1 second. Aliba Daman, who are you asking according to? Rabbi Shimon, mighty boile. What's the question to Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon said that you have to bring a karban even for the first one, right? So there's no question, right? Ha Amar Rabbi Shimon, Safek Nazirut Lahachmir. Ella Aliba Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, or what we call the Tanakam in our Mishnah, the Amar Safek Nazirut Lahakel, my kadosh, alo kadosh. Is the animal kadosh or not kadosh? Now ask the Gemara, but you're probably wondering, why do we care, right? Because the next day the woman had a baby anyways. And so then you have to bring Nazirut, so you can make the animal, you could say Mimanavshach, right? I, the husband, the father, have to be a Nazir, because either the first kid or the second kid. So this animal will be my Karban Nazir, either for the first kid or the second kid. So why does it matter which one it's for? My nafkamina, who cares? Well, it matters. What about, right? Remember, if an animal's kodesh, you can't use any of the shearings from that animal. You can't work with that animal. So let's say on Tuesday, you made this animal kodesh, and then on Thursday, the wife gave birth to the viable child. So what about all the work of the animal, the milk, let's say, or the giza, the skin, what do you call giza, the wool, right? That you shear between those 2 days. Can you use them or not? So what's the halacha for those? So it says in our taker, we don't really have an answer. We don't know for sure the answer. And again, Tosfos says the reason we have a question here more than the Mishnah, which went straight out and said, oh, if the woman has a miscarriage, that baby is not viable or not assumed to be viable, and there's no Nazirut, is because here there was a twin that was viable, and so it makes it more likely that the first one was. So that's that case. Next question. Where are we? Teiko. There we go. 7 lines from the bottom. But very interesting question. Very interesting question. Ba'amine ben Rechumi me Abaya. Ben Rechumi It's a very interesting name as well, right? The son of the Rachum, the son of the compassionate one, sounds like, said to Abaya, Harini Nazir liben. Right? Again, this is our Mishnah. A man is desperate to have a son. He whatever happened, he's tried, he's failed. He says, I promise I will dedicate myself as a Nazir for 30 days when I have a son, not if, when I have a son. Okay, which is beautiful. Shamach Havero v'amar v'alai. The guy sitting next to him, and it's like we did this yesterday. We make a pledge, right? I'm going to dedicate this. The guy next to you says, "Me too." Now, alai doesn't mean me too. Alai we had va'ani means me too. Alai means I accept that on myself also. Alai means on me. So now the question is, what does that mean on me? That if you have a son, I'll also be a Nazir because I'm so grateful, or if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir. Right? You're so dedicated. You want to have a son, so you'll be a Nazir. Me too. If I have a son, I'll also be a Nazir. So that's the question. Mahu. Adibura mashma, is he talking about the words? Meaning you said, if the words you said were, if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir. And so when I say, I'm saying, I also, if I have a son, will be a Nazir. Or agufe mashma, you're referring to the event, which is the first guy said, if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir. And Shimon says, if you have a son, I'll also be a Nazir. Right? So which one are you committing to? It's a good question. It says, well, Imtim Salomar, it seems likely to me that Agufe Mashma, that you're referring to the event that he's talking about. That's how, there's a couple of different ways to understand the Girsa. I'm going to read it this way, right? That you're referring to Agufe, right? Referring to the other person, meaning the event, right? But what if you said, Amar Harini Nazir Likishiyah Liben, I'm going to read this Girsa. Again, there's two different Girsot here. I would be a Nazir. A man says, I'll be a Nazir when I have a son. V'shama chaver v'amar ve'ani. Me too. Now here, instead of saying I lie, right, I'm saying ve'ani, which implies it's about me. So mao, anafshe kamar, odilma. Am I saying, okay, I want the same thing for me, meaning when I have a son, I'll also be a Nazir? Or am I saying, odilma hachi kamar, v'chimcha licha kavadech? I have prayed for you and desire for you the same thing you want, right? Meaning, va'ani, not that I want the same commitment, that if I have a son, I'll be a Nazir, but I also feel your pain, right? This has been Rechumi speaking. But I also feel compassionate for you. And I also want you to have a son and will be a Nazir if you have a son. So which one do you mean, right? So in Tim Salomar, now some would say that you might say, if you conclude that kol ba'ampei, anytime you're in front of a person, ksifa le milta, you're embarrassed to talk about your own trouble. Right? Think about it. Someone is in front of you and is complaining and is in pain because they're having trouble conceiving and they can't have a child and something terrible, right? And they say, I wish I could have it, and if I do, I commit myself to Hashem. And then you get up and say, I'm also having trouble. I also, it's not appropriate. This person is in front of you talking about their things. You're embarrassed to talk about yourself. So presumably when you said me too, you're saying, I also feel compassionate for you. And if you have a son, I'm going to be a Nazir. Because it's inappropriate to raise your own issues when someone else is complaining about their issues, right? Or discussing it. That's the assumption. I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? But what if the person wasn't there? What if someone says, Harini Nazir, because she yelled ploni ben? Ruvain is standing, I'm to use names, we use our Shvatim names. Ruvain is telling the story, it's so difficult. Shimon is trying to have a child, he can't have a child. I feel so bad for Shimon that if he has a son, I Ruvain will be a Nazir, right? Now Levi is standing there, Levi says, me too. So then the question is, Levi's not compassionate with Shimon, Shimon's not even there, right? So we're taking for granted if Shimon was standing there and said, I can't have a child, I pray for one, and if I have one, I'll be a Nazir. And Levi said, me too, he'd be supporting his friend Shimon. But Shimon's not there, right? Reuven is doing it on his behalf. So now when Levi says, me too, do we understand that he's saying, I also have compassion for Shimon? Or he's saying, I also want to have a child, and I also will be a Nazir if I have a child, right? So let's read the case, the top line. Amar Hareini Nazir l'kishiyah leploni ben. I say, Reuven says, I'll be a Nazir if Shimon has a son, when Shimon has a son. V'shama chavero, and Levi hears, Amar, me too, va'ani, mahu. Me amrinan, do you say, look, Shimon's not there, so I'm not, there's no real pressure for me to be compassionate or talk about Shimon. Shelo b'fanav anav shekamar. So he's saying it about himself. He's saying, I want to have a child, right? Me too. I also desperately want to have a son, and I promise I'll be a Nazir if I have a son. Oh, Dilma, hachikamale. Or maybe he's saying, no. Rachim chale kavatech. You feel bad for Shimon. I also feel bad for Shimon. I also will be a Nazir if he has a son. So I will pray for him. I'll do my tehillim also. Tiba'i. And so we don't have an answer. This word tiba'i is the equivalent to the word teku, right? We had it a lot in Nedarim, not a lot, but some. It's a weird thing because the first part of the Gemara said teku, and the Gersa, at least in the Mefarish, is teku, but our Gemara says tiba'i. We just don't know the answer. So these are complex questions about how sympathy works, right? How you sympathize with someone else. Are you talking about the same problem, or are you talking about their problem? And that is something we did not resolve. Okay, that's that case. One more Mishnah for today. Give me 1 second. Now we get complicated. And we're only going to get started. I'm going to stop before it gets too complicated. I'm going to say it's because the daf changes, but it's really because it gets too complicated for me. But the question now comes up. Let's say you do 2 Nazirut, right? So, it's, well, we'll see the cases. They're complicated, but obviously we've had cases before where a person can say, I'll be a Nazir 3 times, let's say, right? In which case you do a Nazir one after the other. You do one, you cut your hair and bring a carbon, you do a second, you do a third. But let's say you made them sort of conditional. We'll see the case. Says the Mishnah down Yud Gimel Amud Bet. It's a very strange thing going on there. Hareini Nazir. A person stands up and says, I want to be a Nazir. Period. And furthermore, and this often happens, right? You get very inspired. And vin Nazir l'kishiyili ben. And I'm also going to be a Nazir when I have a son. So basically, I'm going to be a Nazir twice. And it turns out, maybe he knew, maybe he didn't know, his wife is pregnant. And hitchil moned shelo, he starts being a Nazir. He says, I'm going to be a Nazir. You got to do 30 days. Let's just say it's a 30-day Nazirut. You start counting 30 days. And then the Mefarish likes the case of 20 days passed. 20 days have passed. V'achakach nolad lo ben. And then you have a son. So now we don't know what happens. Because when you have a son, your second Nazirut is supposed to kick in. But your second Nazirut can't kick in the middle of your first Nazirut. So what happens? Says the Mishnah, you have to wait. Mashlimet shelo, you finish your first Nazirut, meaning, and we use shelo here as opposed to shel beno, right? You're doing this one on your own, basically, as opposed to the one you're doing for your son. So you finish your first Nazirut, you do another 10 days, you then cut your hair, bring a karban, and then you start the second Nazirut that you promised because you had a son. That seems pretty obvious, but we're going to see the flip case gets complicated. So mashlimet shelo, you finish your Nazirut, v'acharkach moned shel beno, and then you count the days for the Nazirut for your son. But what if you said the opposite? And this case is very important. Hareini Nazir l'kishiyah li ben. Man gets up and he says, when his wife's pregnant, he's praying for a safe delivery, a healthy kid. He says, I promise that when that baby comes out, that son comes out healthy, alive, I will be a Nazir. And you know what? I'll be a Nazir now also. Vin Nazir, right? And I'll be a Nazir right now. So there's no baby yet. So hitchil moned shelo. So you start counting out your Nazirut. You do 20 days. And then the wife gives birth. V'acharkach nolad lo ben. Then the person's wife gives birth. Okay? So what do? Says our Mishnah, you stop your Nazirut. Miniach et shelo, you pause your own. Umoned shel beno, and you do 30 days for the Nazirut for your son, and then according to this is the way the Mefarish and the other Rishonim some Rishonim understand it. Then you cut your hair and you bring your karban. V'acharkach mashlim et shelo, and then you have to finish the days that you didn't finish of your own. Now the problem with that, of course, and then bring a karban. The problem is that you can never have a Nazirut that's less than 30 days, right? Never. Because as we said, the definition of Nazirut is you have to grow your hair, and your hair doesn't grow. No one gets a haircut more often than every 30 days. No one, right? Except for B'nai Belachim. But so you can't have Nazirut less than 30 days. So the Mefarish says the case in our Mishnah has to be where you said, I will be a Nazir when I have a son, and I want to be a Nazir for 50 days starting now. Okay? Again, just by example. And then you're a Nazir for 20 days, and then your wife has a baby. So you have 30 days left. So you don't cut your hair. You do 30 days right then for the son. Then you cut your hair and bring your karban. Then you do 30 more days of your original 50. And then you cut your hair and bring the karban. But you don't have to make up the whole 50. You just do 30. Okay, that's the Mefarish pshat. Tosfos has another pshat, which I think is very exciting. And you'll see in tomorrow's daf where each one is supported. Tosfos says, I disagree with that pshat. What happens is that you did 20 days, let's say, of your own, right? You then do 30 days for your son. You don't bring a karban. You finish your days and you bring 2 karbanot when it's all over at the end. So you don't have to interrupt. You just basically count. No, of course, why does it matter, right? Because what do the days matter, right? So we'll see in the Gemara why it might matter. But according to what I just told you, it should matter. You know, the only difference is that you don't cut your hair in the middle, right? Basically, you did 20 days. You do 30 more days, then you cut your hair and you bring 2 karbanot, but you don't cut your hair twice. That's our Mishnah. Now, boy, Rava. Now, Rava asked the following question. Let's say, Omer Harini Nazir La'achar Esrim Yom. Person says, tonight's Tu B'Shvat, right? I want to be a Nazir starting 20 days from now. Starting on the 5th day of Adar, I want to be a Nazir. Okay? That's when I'm coming back from a business trip, whatever. I have a lot of big parties before then. Oh, before sure, that was right. It's a problem before Purim. Okay, a month from now, right after Purim, I'm going to be a Nazir. I got to finish my Pesach. It's a very bad season to be a Nazir, I guess, right? I guess you got to wait till after Pesach. Anyways, you say, Hareini Nazir la'achar esrim yom. I'm going to be a Nazir in 20 days. And then you say, ume'achshav me'a yom. You know what? I'm going to be a Nazir now for 100 days. Now, just for the math's sake, right? 100 is longer than 20, just to point that out. So I say, I want to be a Nazir now for 100 days, but not yesterday, 3 minutes ago, I said, I want to be a Nazir in 20 days. You can't be a Nazir for 100 days and do another one in 20 days. Just doesn't add up. So Mahu, what do you say? Kivan dahalen meya be'esrin lo shalmin, right? You're obviously not going to finish your 100 days of Nazirut by the time your 20-day Nazir, your 20-day Nazirut is supposed to happen, right? So therefore, maybe lo chaylik. Maybe you don't start your 100-day Nazirut. You have to do it, but maybe you don't start. You said, I want to do it from now, but it's not possible to do it from now. So maybe you should wait 20 days, drink as much as you want, in 20 days, start your Nazirut, do it for 30 days, cut your hair, be done with it, and then do 100 days for your second Nazirut. So that's one possibility. O Dilma, or do you say, maybe look, start your 100-day Nazirut, do 20 days. At the end of 20 days, you have to then start your Nazirut that you previously accepted, right? Which was the Nazirut in 20 days. Do that for 30 days. And then at the end, how many days do you have left for your Nazirut? You have 80 days left. But that's okay. You can have 80 days left because even if you cut your hair then at the end of those 30 days, it'll grow again in the 80 days and you'll have enough time to do a second Nazirut, which sounds a lot like Mefarish, right? So that's the question. It's enough time to do a whole Nazirut afterwards, meaning a minimum of 30 days, or do you say it doesn't happen, it doesn't take effect at all? It says the Gemara, that's an interesting question, but it would have been an even more interesting question if you were only being a Nazir for 30 days, right? Because if I had said, I want to be a Nazir in 20 days, and I want to be a Nazir starting today for 30 days, right? So now 30 days, you would do 20 of them, and then start your new Nazirut, but you'd only have 10 left at the end. So you'd have a bigger question, right? Because it's impossible to do a 20-day Nazirut and then a 10-day Nazirut. 10 days is not Nazirut, right? You have to do 30. So it says, why don't you ask about a minimum size Nazirut? It says, well, no, we're asking both questions. We're asking one question nested in the other question, meaning, and now we're going to read from the top of Yodal, I'm going to do a couple lines. Im timsa lomar, if you say that Nazirut mu'etet, look, if I had said, I want to be a Nazir in 20 days, and I want to be a Nazir for 30 days starting right now, then kivan de asrin yuminhu diatrin, since only 10 days will be left over, right? You'll do 20 days, you'll pause for your 30 days, and then you'll have 10 days left. But 10 days is not enough for a Nazirut, right? So lo saliklei, so then it never starts, right? There's only 10 days that are left, lo saliklei halein asara, right? Then therefore those 10 days will never start. But if you're if you say, Vaday Nazir Mea Yom, if you say that I want to be a Nazir for 100 days, Kivan itle tamnin yumin lebesov salkin le olo. The question is, since you can start the Nazirut now, do your 20 days, then do your 30 days, and then, again, this sounds a lot like the Mefarish, then you cut your hair, bring a karban, you got 80 days left. So the question is, in that case, do you say that you should start the 100 days now and then do whatever you can before the new Nazirut is chal? Or do you say, forget about it? 20 days you do nothing. This is where obviously has a big implication. The first 20 days you can drink all the wine in the world, even though you said, I want to be a Nazir right now. But you can't be a Nazir right now for 100 days because in 20 days you have to start a different Nazirut. So your now 100 days cannot happen. Stop 20 days, you do nothing. 30, then you start your Nazirut that you previously committed. And when that's done, you could do your 100 days. So that is the question. And tomorrow we will, from the fourth line of Im Tim Salomar, pick up that question and get even more detailed about how one Nazirut affects another Nazirut. Okay, everyone. Exciting and concise. Bimar.
Thank you.
Happy Tu B'Shvat, everyone, and we will hopefully see you all next week.
Thank you and good night.
Happy
Thank you.
Happy New Year.